Hi everyone, I'm Sandie La Nae. Welcome to Psychic Creations History Series. You are about to embark on a blast to the past. We have a very interesting show for you today as we are going to be featuring the historic accounts of Laura Fair. She was a recognized citizen in Virginia City as she ran the Tahoe House in 1863 to 1870, and portraying the lovely Mrs. Fair is the even more lovely Kim Harris, Chautauqua performer. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, thank you, Miss La Nae. I'm just so happy to be here.
Well, Laura, we are very happy that you are here too. So, could we get right into the show by asking you, Miss Laura, to tell our viewers all about yourself?
I'd be happy to.
Thank you.
Well, I was born Laura Ann Hunt on June 22nd of 1837 in Hollis Springs, Mississippi. At the age of 16, I was a genteel Southern belle when my dear dying father wanted to be sure that I would be well taken care of when he departed this earth. So he arranged for me to marry a Mr. William H. Stone, a man decades older than myself, and thought to be a wealthy businessman hailing from New Orleans. What he was, in fact, was a liquor salesman and a dissipated man. And despite my repeated attempts to get him to give up drinking his whiskey, he would not. So I decided when I was 18 that I must extricate myself from this situation. But luckily, fate stepped in and Mr. Stone died of natural causes. But I had no means of supporting myself, so I entered a convent in order to learn some teaching skills. 6 months later, I stepped out of that convent and into the arms of my next husband, Mr. Tom Grayson. Mr. Tom Grayson was an associate of the late Mr. Stone. I soon learned that associate was also synonymous with the word customer, as he was also a drunk and a violent one at that. Why, he used to make me lie on our bed and he'd level his pistol and shoot just above my head to prove to me what an excellent marksman he was. After shooting off the heads of many of our chickens in the yard, I decided that I must end this marriage before he ended my life. So I convinced Mr. Grayson that he could file for divorce against me on grounds of desertion, which I did so with great haste. So Mama and I left for San Francisco, where I opened a boarding house. But San Francisco was in a depression at the time, and my boarding house wasn't very successful. But I was not disheartened. Mama and I left for Shasta, where I opened a boarding house there and met with much greater success. And that's also where I met Mr. William D. Fair, a successful attorney, graduate of West Point, and a colonel hailing from Virginia down south. After we were married and when our child was on the way, I also learned that Mr. Fair was also a great inventor, or shall I say reinventor, of his own life story. And he was not nearly as successful businessman as he portrayed himself to be. So after our daughter was born, Lillian Lorraine, I always called her Baby, I convinced Mr. Fair that we should move to San Francisco, where he would have more opportunities for his less than lucrative law practice. Well, Mr. Fair was not a very motivated man, so I kept after him and after him and after him so that we could have a place in society that was something that we deserved. Alas, it was not to be. Out of desperation, Mr. Fair put a gun to his head and blew his brains out. Well, this put me in quite a pickle. Well, now I had Mama to support and the baby, and also a string of debts that Mr. Fair left us. And San Francisco had lost some of its luster for me. So I took Mama and baby, and we went to Sacramento, where I opened a boarding house there. And it was successful, but it did not earn enough money to pay off all of our debts. So one of my boarders, who was a stage actor, convinced me that I, too, could earn money acting on the stage. So I took the part of Lady Teasel in School for Scandal. And I have to admit, I was a great success. I earned enough money on the stages in Sacramento and San Francisco to pay off all of our debts and pocket $250. So I took Mama and Baby and we headed across the Sierras to that Silver City in Nevada Territory. I arrived in Virginia City in early 1863 and I rented the newly built Tahoe house. I redecorated it, renovated it, and opened it as a boarding house with 33 rooms, more than any other similar one on the Comstock. And it was a great success, better than any endeavor I had ever encountered myself. And at the age of 26, I was highly regarded as both beautiful and charming. I had a string of beaux and suitors that would escort me to every opera and ball. And I also entertained the leading citizens of the West daily in my parlor rooms at the Tahoe house. It was in fall of 1863 that a wealthy San Francisco attorney by the name of Alexander Parker Crittenden arrived in Virginia City and secured a suite of rooms at my Tahoe house. Oh, he was a handsome 47-year-old, well-associated widower. Well, he almost immediately insisted that I dismiss all other beaux. Of course, we fell deeply in love, and I was never far from his arm, whether out on C Street or in our rooms. As a sign of his devotion, he purchased a beautiful home for me up on A Street. Now, being the sound-minded businesswoman that I am, I let out 2 of those rooms to boarders, but I saved the rest as private for myself and Mr. Crittenden. Mr. Crittenden was a very good attorney. When the question arose as if I was actually divorced from Mr. Grayson, it was Mr. Crittenden who made the legal inquiries necessary to clear up that affair. He also was very good at mining stocks. He advised me very well, and I invested in several stocks and at one time had $140,000, all with several mines up in Virginia City. Well, imagine my shock when several months later, Mrs. Crittenden showed up in Virginia City, very much alive and with several of their children. I was beside myself. What was I to do? I couldn't simply fall out of love with him. Well, eventually Mr. Crittenden did convince me that he had always intended to divorce Mrs. Crittenden, and he professed his undying love to me, asking me to marry him. Of course, I said yes. Alas, days turned into weeks, and weeks turned into months, and months turned into years, without Mr. Crittenden fulfilling his promises. Always the excuses and the letters, those letters full of such passion, threatening to kill himself or us both if I ever left him. I saved every letter, and every letter brought me back to him. For 7 long years, I followed Mr. Crittenden between Virginia City and San Francisco, hoping and praying he would leave his wife and family. The entire affair was so wearisome and taxing on my health that my doctor, Dr. Lyford, had to prescribe larger and larger doses of chloral hydrate just to soothe my nerves. And then eventually I developed some very serious female issues that put me in a state of hysterics for a short time each month. And then I even married a 4th time to a Mr. Jesse Snyder, a man that I did not love, in an effort to leave Mr. Crittenden and to get on with my life. When Mr. Crittenden found out, he was furious. He threatened to kill Mr. Snyder or us both for what we had done. I remember very clearly the night that Mr. Crittenden came to my rooms and pounded on the door, demanded to be let in. And I refused, but he knocked the door down and threatened me, I thought, with my life. I went and got my pistol, and I fired over his head. I never intended to hurt him. No, that was not my intention at all. I just wanted him to know that he had frightened me so. Well, eventually we reconciled, as we always did, and he sent his wife away to Indiana to obtain a divorce, never to return to San Francisco. I rejoiced. I had finally won my battle. I would finally become the rightful Mrs. Crittenden. And months later, when I was doing business with a furniture salesman, imagine my surprise when I learned the news that Mrs. Crittenden was due to return to San Francisco. And Mr. Crittenden had purchased all new furniture for their home to celebrate the occasion. I was furious. Well, Mr. Crittenden tried to explain to me that he had never intended to live with them, and in proving that, he moved all of his possessions into my home. I confess, I was desperate. Was this one more lie in a string of lies? I convinced myself that if I could be present when Mr. Crittenden met his wife at the train in Oakland, and if I saw any sign of affection, I would know that Mr. Crittenden could no longer be trusted. So on November 3rd of 1870, I disguised myself with a large black hat and a large veil, and I threw on a large black cape, and I followed Mr. Crittenden onto the ferry El Capitan. As we crossed the San Francisco Bay, I stayed hidden from him, and I was unable to follow him as he disembarked the ferry in Oakland. But from my vantage point, I could see them clearly when he re-embarked with his family. And as they were seated, Mrs. Crittenden slipped her arm through his and gazed at him with such genuine love and adoration that I knew I had my answer. And what I now know is this. In a moment of hysterics and blind rage, I pulled the trigger on my Sharp's Derringer, and my Mr. Crittenden was no more. 4 times married, twice divorced, and twice widowed, all by the age of 33. I finally came to my senses in the courtroom of my trial for the murder of Alexander P. Crittenden. From that terrible day in November until March of 1871, I lived in a state of hysterics and delirium. I was told that I even bit a piece of glass out of a tumbler of water that had been offered to me, and my doctor, Dr. Lyford, had to extricate that from my mouth before I swallowed it. After that, they would only let me use a tin cup. Dr. Lyford kept me sedated through the entire trial with a mixture of chloral hydrate and other opiates. The trial was a sham. Why, yes, of course, it was an all-male jury, but the prosecutor and the judge were close personal friends of the late Mr. Crittenden. And the newspapers, they printed such outright lies against me, turning the public against me. The trial lasted nearly a month, but I believe it was over with at the very beginning. Why, the prosecution paraded every moment of my public and private life to the courtroom and jury. My marriages, my divorces, my legal troubles, our letters, the other shootings. Why, they made me out to be no better than a prostitute and the worst threat to the sanctity of home and marriage. Why, they argued, they actually had witness after witness testifying to my wicked reputation. And when my attorneys cross-examined them, not a one of them could cite any personal knowledge of such behavior. Why, they made me out to be a temptress and an adulteress, while men like Mr. Crittenden were thought to be just weak-minded when it came to a pretty face. It seemed that my only support came from suffragists like Emily Pitt Stevens and Susan B. Anthony and Katie Dean Stanton, who were repeatedly referred to as strong-minded women, and like myself, better than we ought to be. My attorneys argued that I should be found innocent by reason of temporary insanity. Insanity, that's a hard pill to swallow. It does not paint a pretty picture in one's mind. But they argued that Mr. Crittenden's repeated deceptions, along with my female issues, put me in such a state of hysterics that I could not be held responsible for my actions. It was all for naught, however. The jury, after 26 days of trial, deliberated for only 40 minutes, finding me guilty, and I then became the first woman in California to be sentenced to hang by the neck until dead. Well, I told the newspapers that I was too pretty to hang. And after just a few months, with only a few days to spare, my attorney secured me a new trial. He got my sentence overturned, and I got a stay of execution. He submitted that I had been tried unfairly solely on my reputation, and as well that the defense did not get the final argument. So in this trial, he explained to me, much to my dismay, that I would not be able to testify on my own behalf because I had appeared a bit too sane in the first trial. He said that in this trial I would be tried solely on the idea if I was sane at the time that I pulled the trigger. Once again, uncomfortable with the question of my sanity, I submitted an expert testimony of several doctors, explained the causes and the signs of temporary insanity, including my own diagnosed female issues. Well, the jury deliberated much longer in this case, but they eventually returned with finding me not guilty. I was so excited. Finding me not guilty. And I rejoiced that I would finally be able to return to society with open arms. Imagine my disappointment when life after my acquittal was not exactly as I had imagined. Why, I was found not guilty. So why was I not welcomed back into society with open arms? Why am I continuously shunned on the streets of San Francisco? Why, did I not prove in both trials that I could stand equally with a man, that a beautiful woman could be equal? Did I not prove how unjust we the fairer sex are treated? I have planned a lecture entitled Wolves in the Fold at Platt's Hall in San Francisco. I have been warned that if I go through with it, there will be great violent protest, but I will go through with it. I do not mind. I will not be silenced again. I have to prove that we are pure. I invite everyone to attend and to become more enlightened as to my life and how often we the fairer sex are mistreated. And if any of the men are still interested in marrying me, I'm not interested right now, just yet.
Laura Fair, it has been so interesting learning about your fabulous history. Now with you, Kim Harris, can you tell our viewers how you were inspired to create the Laura Fair character?
Yes, I can. I'd be happy to, because it's kind of a funny story. Actually, when I had a friend who had talked about Laura Fair as a part in a play, and I kept thinking that she was the wife of another Fair who lived in Virginia City. And she was benevolent and gave to the Catholic Church and so forth, and I thought, oh, you know, that sounds like a okay character. And she would tell me, no, no, no. Laura Fair is the one that killed her husband and was the first woman that was sentenced to death in California. And she killed her lover after, you know, a 7-year affair with him. You know, I think it was about a 7-year affair. And so I thought, oh, okay, this isn't an upstanding woman. This is very interesting. And so she was in Virginia City and for a short time, and she was also in San Francisco. And so I thought her story was very interesting because it wasn't just, you know, a cut and dried. She was basically driven to it by several different venues. Mm-hmm. And she's just a very interesting character to me. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I eventually, the most famous working girl, Julia Boulay, I got talked into portraying her, and her story is very interesting too. It's not another story that's not cut and dried. I portray Lillian Virgin-Finnigan, who started the candy dance in Genoa, and did I say 4 or 5? Is that
Charley.
4? Charley, thank you. From the audience.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, this is good. I need help, obviously. Charley Parkhurst is a stagecoach driver, and that's another interesting story because Charley was in this area, drove with Hank Monk, spent most of his life driving, and then retired when he got rheumatism. And upon his death at an old age, he was given a funeral by the Oddfellows, and the Oddfellows was an organization he belonged to. They discovered that he was a she. So she, Charlotte, had lived her entire life as a man for a very interesting reason. She was kind of forced to do that so she could drive a stagecoach. Otherwise, they would never have hired her. Mm-hmm. And then, yes, my 5th character is Laura Fair. And it was mainly because I had to have another use for a ball gown that I spent money on.
Well, I think that's a real good reason.
But she was a very interesting story because it was not cut and dried. I mean, she had idiosyncrasies about her, but she didn't live to a conformed standard. You could never keep her down. She wouldn't let anybody tell her she couldn't do something, and she wasn't afraid to marry anyone.
Right. Yes, that's obvious.
But she kept marrying up, she thought, and she truly wasn't in love with who was she in love with? Yes, Alexander Parker Crittenden. Yes, I lost his name. She truly was in love with him, and he strung her along. Mm-hmm. And by today's standards, we know that she had what we call premenstrual syndrome, or PMS, and she had several female issues. And I believe that affected her decision-making towards the end of his life. And she had convinced herself that just by, watching he and his wife, that he was not going to be true to her. And I have to say that I agree with her because he strung her along.
Yeah, for 7 years?
Yeah, he was never going to let go of his wife and, his family and his standing. So I thought that was an interesting story.
Sure.
Yeah.
And you got a use for your beautiful ball gown.
Yes, this ball gown that was actually I had made for a Civil War ball. The battle-born Civil War reenactors threw a ball each year, and I had to have this made, but at the expense that I spent on it, I had to have another reason to use it.
Sure.
And this is interesting how I found Laura because I kept getting confused with who she was. There was another Fair, in Virginia City, and his wife, is who I thought Laura Fair was. And when I found out her story, I thought it was much more interesting because, she was never say die. You couldn't keep her down.
Sure.
She was married several times, and she didn't let that affect her. She was the darling of Virginia City. She had beaux left and right, and she wasn't afraid to conduct business and open boarding houses. Interesting thing about her, though, is she felt she was upstanding. She was introduced to Julia Boulay by Julia's very good friend, who the name escapes me right now, but she was insulted that she was expected by Julia's friend to associate with Julia. Julia was a fallen woman. Julia was a prostitute, and Laura and her mother were just appalled that they had to even run into her on the street. Mm-hmm. So it's interesting that she became a mistress, but Laura felt in the eyes of God that she was married because she and Crittenden loved each other. Mm-hmm. She actually at one point told Mrs. Crittenden, when Mrs. Crittenden came to meet Laura and said, "I will never divorce my husband," Laura said, "You aren't married. You are the adulteress, Mrs. Crittenden, because he is not in love with you, he's in love with me. So in the eyes of God, we are married and you're the adulteress." So she kind of started to sound a little crazy, but that is how much she felt that she was in the right. Yeah. And she really absolutely loved him. And she did at one time try to break free of him, and it didn't work, as you heard in the monologue. It didn't work, and he got her back.
Isn't that interesting? I'll be darned.
Yeah.
Now, if you don't mind, Miss Kim and Miss Laura, I really like to ask our history guests one particular question that's dear to my heart. When you were doing research on Laura Fair, do you feel that you were channeling her, or that she was speaking to you to find just the perfect information to speak about her?
I do, and I wondered at first if I could find her, because I do ask when I'm performing a character, and you know, I mentioned the 5 that I'm performing, I ask for their help, because it's not just a play, it's teaching about their life. It's showing, it's trying to fill in the pieces that people who've written about them don't know. So I feel I have to ask their permission and portray them in a sensitive way, but in a realistic way, because everybody is flawed. And Laura was flawed. I believe Laura was very narcissistic, okay?
Oh, sure.
And I believe that she was a very smart businesswoman that nobody could put down. I believe that she probably, for what she knew of love, she probably did love him. But I wanted to ask her permission so that she would help me understand her and portray her realistically. And I believe that when I do my characters, and even with Laura, I try not to make fun of, you know, of her idiosyncrasies.
Sure.
But I believe that she did help me bring some light and sensitivity to her situation. So I tried to portray her in a realistic way, but I've kind of had a conversation with her, letting her know that, you know, I have to, the good, the bad, and the ugly. And,
Right.
And she seems to be okay with that to a certain
good.
extent.
Well, poetic justice here, huh? Awesome. Oh, that's wonderful. That's wonderful.
Yeah, but I've grown to like her and to understand her a little bit. I hope so. Not that I would do everything
so.
she did,
Right.
you know, but anyway, but I've grown to like her, and I hope that she is happy with the way I'm telling her story.
I think she is.
I hope so.
Yeah. Kim, thank you so much for being a wonderful guest
Well, thank
on
you.
Psychic Creations History Series.
It's always a pleasure. It is.
Well, thank you.
Sandie.
Yes, you've been on our show quite a few times. I like that idea.
Some people would call it multiple personality.
Oh, well, and
Disorder.
I know. And thank you, Laura, for being a guest on our Psychic Creation History Series, too.
Well, you're very welcome.
All right. Thank you so much for joining us on Psychic Creation History Series. And if you would like to be a guest on the show, you can contact me at my website, which is www.sandiepsychicstones.com, or at my email address, which is admin@sandiepsychicstones.com. Thank you for watching Psychic Creations, and remember, history created who we are today.